If you've ever driven through the wild plains of Wyoming on a crisp autumn afternoon, you might have noticed a lone ranch sitting quietly in the vast open land, its roof dusted with pine needles, the sky heavy with gray, and the wind whispering something sorrowful through the trees. That ranch belongs to Jackson Cole, a man who once served as a Marine and later became a millionaire after inventing a life-saving technology used on the battlefield. But no invention in the world could save his wife from the accident that took her away. For 3 years since her death, Jackson has lived like a ghost. He never remarried. He kept to himself, just moving between the kitchen, the barn, and his study where the walls are covered with photos of his wife and son. His son, Ethan, only 8 years old, used to be a lively boy, always climbing trees and kicking soccer balls around. But after the accident, Ethan lost all movement in his legs, and worse, he stopped talking to anyone. No doctors, no nurses, no nanny could get through to him. Jackson tried everything, the best people, the most expensive specialists. But Ethan would always look away, silent. It was as if the boy lived in another world, one no one else was allowed to enter. Until the day she arrived. And when Jackson checked the security footage that night, he saw something he hadn't seen in 3 years. Ethan, reaching out his hand and holding hers. And, sometimes the quietest people walk into your life and change everything without making a sound. That's exactly what happened the day Maya Bennett showed up at Jackson Cole's ranch. It was early morning, Wyoming sky still wrapped in fog, the kind that makes the trees look like they're holding their breath. Inside the house, everything was silent. Too silent. Even the coffee machine in the kitchen sounded loud. Jackson stood in the entryway, arms crossed, jaw tight. He'd been through this before, 7 times in the last 6 months. Every nanny had walked in full of hope and walked out with nothing but frustration. No one lasted more than 2 weeks. And now, here she was. Not what he expected. Maya wasn't polished like the others. She didn't have a fancy resume, no recommendation letters with gold seals, just a soft voice over the phone, and a willingness to try. When she stepped into the house, the first thing she did was look around, not at the grand staircase, not at the expensive furniture, but at the photos on the wall. She paused in front of one, a picture of Ethan before the accident, laughing in his mom's arms. Maya smiled, just a little. Then she turned to Jackson. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. Her tone was calm, no nervous giggle, no forced charm, just calm. Jackson nodded once. "I'll be honest, Miss Bennett. My son doesn't talk. He won't eat with anyone but me, and he hasn't let a single nanny stay longer than a week without locking them out of his room." Maya didn't flinch. She simply replied, "Then I won't try to force anything. I'll just sit nearby, be present." Jackson studied her, eyes narrowing slightly. Years of military training told him to read people fast. Most fidget under pressure. Maya didn't. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her hands never moved to adjust her hair or clothes. She didn't even glance at her phone. There was a quiet strength in her. And strangely, that unsettled him. He led her down the hall, toward Ethan's room. The floor creaked under their feet, an old ranch sound he had long since tuned out. But for some reason, with Maya there, he noticed it again. When they reached the door, Jackson hesitated. "Don't expect much," he warned. She didn't answer, just gave him a small nod and stepped inside alone. The room was dim. Curtains drawn tight. A single lamp lit the corner. Toys untouched on shelves. Books closed. And on the bed, curled up against the wall like a wounded animal, was Ethan. Maya didn't walk straight to him. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she sat down quietly on the floor, a few feet from the bed. Cross-legged, like she was in no rush at all. And then she did something Jackson hadn't expected. She opened a notebook. And she started sketching. Not him, not Ethan, just the outline of a tree, a swing, a little boy. Her pencil moved softly. No pressure, no noise, just presence. Ethan didn't turn around, but his fingers, barely noticeable, shifted slightly. After a while, Maya spoke, barely above a whisper. "I don't know if you like drawing, but when I was little I used to draw what I couldn't say." No response. But he didn't pull the blanket over his head either. That alone was a first. Outside, in the hallway, Jackson watched through the cracked door. One hand braced on the wall, heart caught somewhere between surprise and disbelief. Something about this woman, this quiet, grounded woman, was different, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was watching another disappointment unfold. He felt something else. Possibility. And that night, when Jackson reviewed the security footage, not to spy but out of habit, he froze. Because there, on the screen, he saw Ethan, not speaking, but listening. Ethan, his 8-year-old son, hadn't spoken a word to anyone since the day his mother died. Paralyzed from the waist down after the accident, Ethan locked himself away in his room. No crying, no yelling, no interaction. It was like he wasn't really there anymore. Jackson had hired everyone he could, child psychologists with impressive degrees, rehab specialists from the best pediatric centers, but Ethan ignored them all. He wouldn't even look at them. Then came Maya. She didn't try to put on a show. She didn't flash a big smile or bring in flashy toys. She didn't try to force her way in. On her first day, she simply sat on the floor in the hallway, just outside Ethan's door. Quietly, she placed a small red toy truck on the ground, old chipped paint, a few scratches on the side. Then, without saying a word, she stood up and walked away. The next morning, the truck was gone. That was the moment Jackson knew. For the first time in months, someone had approached Ethan the right way. Gently, respectfully, patiently. Maya didn't knock. She didn't speak through the door. On the third day, she left a small foam ball, bright blue, along with a simple handwritten note. "If you want to, you can throw this against the wall. It won't get mad." That afternoon, she sat outside in the hallway again. Still. Quiet. Waiting. No footsteps, no voices, just one soft sound. Thump, a faint, hollow bounce came from behind the closed door. Jackson, watching from his office, sprang out of his chair like he'd just heard a heartbeat after years of flatline. Ethan had thrown the ball just once. But to Maya, and to Jackson, it was nothing short of a miracle. From that day on, Maya came every day, still never stepping inside. But each time she left something small, thoughtful, full of quiet kindness. An old comic book, a box of crayons, a doodle of a roaring dinosaur with a speech bubble that read, "Grrr!" No questions, no pressure, just a steady, silent message. "I'm here. I'll wait." One morning, Jackson walked down the hallway and froze in place. Ethan's bedroom door was cracked open. Not wide, just enough to let in the light. And inside, he saw Ethan, sitting quietly by the door, holding that same red toy truck in his lap. The boy didn't speak, but his eyes looked out into the hallway. And they weren't empty anymore. There was something there, something fragile. Hope and Maya? She sat outside like always, her back resting against the wall, not looking in, not saying a word. She just smiled, softly, as if she already knew. One more step, and that door would open. You know, not all change comes in big, dramatic moments. Sometimes it starts so small, so quiet, you'd miss it if you weren't paying close attention. That was Ethan. The boy didn't suddenly break out of his shell. There was no magical breakthrough, no triumphant music cue, no heart-tugging speech that changed everything overnight. Just quiet days. Every morning, Maya walked into his room with an old comic book. Sometimes Spider-Man, sometimes Calvin and Hobbes. She didn't push. She didn't talk much. She just sat down a few feet away, opened the book, and began to read. Her voice was steady, not overly cheerful, not dramatic. But there was something in the rhythm of it, gentle, dependable, that gave the silent room a heartbeat again. One afternoon, Maya found Ethan fast asleep in his wheelchair, slumped over the table. Without a word, she walked over, lifted his small arm, and carefully slid a thin pillow under his elbow so he wouldn't wake up sore. Then she left the room, as quietly as she came in. No thank you expected, no recognition needed. Just a simple act that whispered, "Someone sees you. You matter, even when you're silent." Every evening, Maya brought a soft therapy ball into his room, pale yellow, light as a feather. She didn't ask Ethan to kick it. She didn't tell him to try harder. She simply rolled it gently toward him, then left it there. And walked away. Day after day, she did the same thing. Until one day, the ball wasn't where she left it. It had moved, just a few inches, but Maya noticed, and she smiled. That was the first step. Slowly, Ethan began to shift. He didn't speak, but he started watching her, following her with his eyes when she moved. He didn't laugh, but his shoulders didn't tense when she entered the room anymore. Then one afternoon, something happened that Jackson, his father, would never forget. Maya had been playing a silly game. Guess the animal sound. She meowed for a cow, barked for a cat, and made ridiculous rooster noises. Ethan just stared at her with wide eyes, until she deadpanned, "Cows totally go meow, right? That's what the internet says." And then it came. A sound. Software. Surprising. Ethan laughed. He slapped his tiny hand over his mouth, as if shocked by himself. Maya froze, then burst out laughing too. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just two souls, one who had been silent too long, and one who had waited too patiently, sharing a moment. And down the hallway, Jackson stood frozen, watching the footage on his security monitor. At first, he had only checked the cameras out of duty, making sure the nanny wasn't overstepping. But now he watched because something real was happening, something he hadn't seen in over 2 years. His son laughed. And then it happened. The moment that broke Jackson's heart in the most unexpected way. After losing in another silly round of the game, Maya playfully lowered her head and pretended to pout. And without a word, Ethan reached out and lightly touched her hand. Just a brush of fingers. But in that house, that gesture was louder than any scream, stronger than any words. And for both Maya and Jackson, it meant everything. You know, Jackson Cole never meant to care, not again, not after what he lost. He was a man of order, of routine, of walls built high and solid. Wake at 5, work by 6, check emails, check on Ethan, avoid feeling anything. But here's the thing. Love, real love, it doesn't ask for permission. It slips through the cracks you didn't even know were there. And for Jackson, that crack came in the form of a flickering security monitor and a woman's quiet laughter echoing down the hallway. Every night, after Ethan went to bed and the house fell silent, Jackson did something he never admitted to anyone. He opened the security feed, not to check for danger, not to supervise, but to watch. To watch her. At first it was habit, just making sure things were okay. But then, one night, he caught something that made his chest tighten. On the screen, Maya sat cross-legged on the floor, holding up a ridiculous sock puppet. She spoke in a silly voice, wiggling the puppet's arms like it was alive. And Ethan, his Ethan, threw his head back and giggled. Not just a chuckle, a full, belly-deep laugh. Jackson froze. He hadn't heard that sound in 3 years. Not since before the accident. Not since... her. He turned up the volume, leaned closer. And in that moment, watching from his cold, silent office, Jackson smiled, a small one, almost unsure, but it was real. And from that night on, it became a ritual. The laptop open, the footage playing, while the rest of the world believed Jackson Cole was just checking in. What they didn't know was that every night he watched Maya and Ethan like a man starving for something he'd long given up on. Hope, and it wasn't just the boy she reached. It was the man who had convinced himself he couldn't feel anymore. He started noticing the little things. The way she'd lean in when Ethan whispered. The way she brushed the hair from his forehead before bed. The way she sat beside him. Not over him. Like they were equals. Like she wasn't there to fix him. She was there to see him. And something began to stir in Jackson. A restlessness. A pull. One night, it hit him like a punch to the chest. Ethan was trying to stack a small tower of wooden blocks. His fingers trembled, the muscles still weak. The tower collapsed. Jackson braced himself for the meltdown. But Maya just gasped dramatically, clutching her chest like it was the end of the world. "No! Not the royal fortress!" she cried. "The dragons will win now!" Ethan burst out laughing. And without thinking, Jackson whispered out loud. "She's good." He didn't mean to say it, didn't even realize he had, until the silence in the room made it echo back at him. That's when he knew. This wasn't about a nanny anymore. He wasn't just watching Maya because she was good with Ethan. He was watching her because she made him feel something again. But Jackson was still Jackson. He didn't confront it. He didn't confess. He just sat in his study, alone, with a whiskey glass half full, and watched a woman change his son's life. And maybe, quietly, without knowing it, change his. Now, I want you to picture this. It's late at night. The Wyoming wind howls outside the window like an old ghost that refuses to leave. Jackson Cole is sitting alone in his study. Same spot, same chair, where he's watched the world fall apart and slowly try to rebuild. But tonight, he's not watching the cameras. Tonight, he's reading a file. See, Jackson was never the type to dig into people's pasts. He believed in face value, action over words. But something about Maya wouldn't let him sleep. So he called in a favor. One of those favors you don't ask for unless you really want the truth. And what he found stopped him cold. Maya Bennett, 27, used to be the top of her class at UCLA, studied physical therapy, full scholarship, letters of recommendation from top doctors. She was on track to become one of the most promising rehabilitation specialists in the country. Then, one semester, she just vanished. No official explanation, no transfer, no graduation. Just gone. Jackson sat there for a long time, the file open in his lap, staring at her student photo, young, bright-eyed, full of purpose. And all he could think was, why would someone like that walk away from everything? The next morning, he didn't wait. He found her out by the edge of the field, where she often took Ethan in the late afternoons, just to feel the sun on his face. Ethan was inside now, napping. She was alone, sitting on the wooden fence, arms crossed, eyes on the horizon. "Maya," Jackson called. She turned. The moment their eyes met, she knew something was different. Jackson didn't waste time. "Why did you leave UCLA?" he asked, his voice calm but steady. Maya's lips parted, just slightly. Then she looked away, eyes on the distant hills. He stepped closer. "You were the best in your class. You had every opportunity. And then you just disappeared. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet he almost missed it, she said, "Because I failed." Jackson frowned. Failed what? She didn't look at him when she answered. My little brother Caleb. And just like that, her walls crumbled. She told him everything. How Caleb had been born with a rare neuromuscular disorder. How she had grown up helping him stretch, bathe, learn to move, even when it hurt him. How, in college, she had promised herself she'd find a way to heal him. That was why she studied therapy. That was why she never went to parties. Why she pushed harder than anyone else. I thought if I learned enough, she said, her voice trembling, I could fix him. Jackson stood frozen, the wind brushing past them. But I couldn't. She swallowed. One winter he got pneumonia, and with his condition, his body just couldn't take it. He died in my arms. She finally looked at Jackson. And after that, I couldn't walk into a classroom without hearing his laugh. I couldn't write a paper without seeing his face. So I dropped out. I walked away. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. I didn't come here for a job, she whispered. I came because when I saw Ethan's file, I saw my brother, and I thought, maybe this time, I wouldn't fail. Jackson felt something deep in his chest twist. He had faced combat, buried his wife, watched his son wither into silence. But he hadn't expected this quiet storm of a woman carrying more pain than he ever realized, still showing up every day with kindness and strength. He stepped closer, his voice softer now. You didn't fail him, he said. Maya smiled through the tears. You weren't there. No, Jackson said gently. But I'm here now, and so are you. There was silence. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was full of something else. Understanding. Two broken people, both trying to fix what they couldn't save. And for the first time, maybe they didn't have to do it alone. Jackson was never the kind of man who liked digging into people's private lives. But that night, after quietly watching Maya play with Ethan through the security monitor for what felt like hours, he couldn't stop the question forming in his mind. Who is she really? How does she understand Ethan so well, like she sees a part of herself in him? And when he finally found the answer, it weighed on him like a stone on his chest. The next morning, Jackson didn't dance around it. He found Maya out back, where Ethan was napping. I need to ask you something, he said. Not harshly, but with a tone that told her this wasn't small talk. Maya met his gaze, steady and calm. She didn't flinch. There was something in her eyes, like she'd been waiting for this moment. Jackson pulled out a folder, school transcripts, academic reports, a few printouts. UCLA, physical therapy major, full scholarship, top of your class. He paused, studied her. And then, you disappeared. No reason, no explanation. Maya stood quiet for a few seconds. Then she nodded, softly but firmly. Yes, she said. Jackson folded his arms, still watching her closely. Why? Maya let out a long breath. Not the kind of breath you take when you're tired, but the kind you take right before opening a locked door you haven't touched in years. Dylan, she said. Her voice shook a little. My younger brother. Dylan had cerebral palsy. Since he was a baby. He couldn't walk, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything without someone's help. She glanced down at her hands, clenched them lightly. I loved that boy with everything I had, and I made a promise to myself. I was going to save him. I'd become the best, find a way to help him walk, give him a life he deserved. Her voice cracked. But during my senior year, right when I was studying for finals, Dylan got sick, pneumonia, complications. Maya lifted her head, looked Jackson straight in the eyes. He died in my arms, in that hospital room. There were no tears, just a voice stripped down to the raw truth. After that, I couldn't go back. Every time I sat in class, I didn't see textbooks. I saw Dylan's eyes. I heard his breathing in those last few days. She closed her eyes. And I knew I couldn't save anyone anymore. Jackson stood there, silent. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because for the first time, he understood. Maya hadn't come here just to do a job. She came to make peace with the part of herself she thought she'd lost, to rewrite a story that had ended too soon. She wasn't chasing money. She wasn't chasing praise. She was chasing healing for herself. And in that moment, for the first time, Jackson didn't see her as an employee, not as the nanny he'd hired, but as a person. A woman trying to rise from the ashes of her own pain. A mother, though she never had a child, who loved Ethan with a heart that had once been broken and was slowly learning how to beat again. You know, there's a difference between being there and truly showing up. And for the longest time, Jackson Cole didn't know that difference. He provided for Ethan, made sure he had the best doctors, the safest equipment, the finest therapists money could buy. But he wasn't with him. Not really. His presence was a shadow, moving through the house like a schedule on legs. But after that conversation with Maya, something shifted. It started small. One afternoon, Jackson knocked gently on Ethan's door and said, "Hey, champ, you up for a game of Uno?" Ethan didn't answer, just stared. But he didn't say no, and that was enough. They sat at the kitchen table, Jackson awkwardly holding the colorful cards like they were foreign objects. Ethan watched him closely, unsure, until Jackson laid down the wrong card and grumbled, "I swear these rules change every decade." Ethan smiled, just barely. But it was the first smile Jackson had seen from his son in months. That 15-minute game turned into 30, then into an afternoon of drawing silly monsters on blank printer paper. Jackson had never been an artist, but he tried. His monster had 3 eyes and a cowboy hat. Ethan laughed until he hiccuped. And then came the next step. Maya, patient as always, showed Jackson how to help Ethan stretch his legs. Not forcefully, not clinically, just gentle pressure, a soft voice, and letting Ethan feel in control. Jackson was hesitant at first, his big, calloused hands not used to being gentle. But he followed Maya's lead. He watched her, mimicked her tone, her pace, her stillness, and slowly, Ethan began to trust him. It was in the little things, the way Ethan leaned his head on Jackson's shoulder after their third art session, the way his arms reached out automatically when Jackson entered the room, the way he whispered, "Dad, look," when he managed to lift his foot just an inch higher than the day before. And for Jackson, those inches meant everything. It wasn't dramatic. No big orchestral moment, no instant transformation, just one father learning how to truly be a dad again. One smile at a time, one drawing, one stretch, one "I'm proud of you, son," spoken with a voice that had once forgotten how to say it. Jackson's walls, the ones he had built up brick by brick after his wife died. They didn't come crashing down all at once. But Maya? She placed the first crack. And Ethan? He was the one shining light that found its way through. You know, sometimes the most painful misunderstandings don't come from what someone says, but from what you overhear. That afternoon, Maya was walking past Jackson's home office when she heard his voice through the slightly open door. His tone was sharp, professional. "Yes, I want the best. A full-time therapist with experience in pediatric rehab. Cost is not an issue." Maya froze in place. She didn't step inside. She didn't say a word. But her heart, it sank like a stone. She turned away quietly, her mind racing. No explanations. No confrontation. That night she sat at her small desk, staring at a blank page. Then, with a deep breath, she wrote her resignation letter. Just one simple line. Thank you for everything. But it's time for me to go. No tears, no drama, just that deep, familiar ache of realizing you were once needed, and now you're not. The next morning, Ethan saw Maya quietly packing her sketchbooks into her bag. He rolled his wheelchair toward her, confused. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice small. Maya looked up and tried to smile. "I have to leave, sweetheart. But you'll be okay. You're strong now." Ethan's face crumbled. Tears poured from his eyes. Not the tears of a tantrum, but the raw cry of a child losing someone he truly loves. "I don't want someone else," he sobbed. "I want you. You're my family." Maya dropped to her knees beside him and pulled him into her arms. "You'll always be in my heart, Ethan, no matter where I go." But he just shook his head, clutching her tighter like if he let go, she'd vanish forever. "If you leave, it's just like when Mom left. Everyone leaves." And Maya. She broke. She didn't try to explain, because deep down, she felt it too. From the hallway, Jackson stood frozen, fists clenched. He had never seen his son cry like that, had never seen Maya fall apart, and he had never felt this level of regret until now. "Let me take you to a quiet neighborhood just past midnight." The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy, like it had held its breath for too long. Maya Bennett had just finished folding the last of her laundry when the knock came. Soft, almost hesitant, she opened the door and froze. There he was, Jackson Cole, his shirt still damp from the rain, his eyes tired but determined, and in his arms was Ethan. Asleep, curled into his father's chest like he finally felt safe again. Jackson didn't say hello. He didn't make excuses. He simply held out a folder. Maya took it with trembling hands, her eyes flickering from his to the documents inside. A diploma. Her name. Bachelor of Science in Physical Therapy. Officially issued, signed, and sealed. Completed. Validated. Maya's lips parted, but no words came out. Jackson finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You gave up your dream to save your brother, and then you gave up again, for my son." He stepped closer, eyes locked on hers. Not with pity, but respect. "You've carried everyone else's pain for so long, Maya, but it's time you start living for yourself." Her eyes filled with tears, but she still didn't speak. "And if you'll let me," he added, almost a whisper now, "I'd like us to be a family." Maya looked at Ethan's peaceful face, then back at Jackson. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe she was worth saving too. She didn't say yes right away. She didn't need to. The tears in her eyes, the way she held that diploma like it was something holy, the way she reached up, brushed a strand of hair behind Ethan's ear, and whispered, "You're home now." That was enough. Because sometimes, love doesn't begin with grand gestures. It begins at a doorstep, with a man carrying a child, and the courage to say, "Come back. Let me take you to that evening." The Wyoming sky was on fire, streaks of orange and gold melting into soft purples as the sun dipped low behind the trees. The air was still, like even the wind was holding its breath. Out on the open grass, Ethan stood between the two people who had refused to give up on him. His tiny hands gripped tighter, one in Maya's, the other in his father's. His legs, thin and trembling, took one step, then another, and then one more. You could hear Maya gasp, and Jackson choke back a sob, but they didn't say a word. Because sometimes silence is the loudest kind of love. When Ethan collapsed into their arms, laughing through tears. They didn't celebrate like it was a miracle. They held him like it was life. And right there, still on his knees, Jackson pulled something from his pocket. A small box. Simple. Weathered at the corners. But when he opened it, inside was a ring that shimmered like the sky above them. He turned to Maya, voice low, steady, full of every emotion he'd never said out loud. For the longest time, I forgot how to dream. But today, watching our son take that step, for the first time in years, I want to dream again, and my dream has you in it. Maya didn't speak. She couldn't. The tears on her cheeks said everything for her. She nodded. And when she wrapped her arms around them both, Jackson and Ethan, it wasn't just a yes to marriage. It was a yes to healing, to belonging, to being whole again. There are wounds we carry for years, wounds we hide so deep we forget they're still bleeding. But sometimes, life sends us people who don't fix us. They just sit with us in the dark long enough for us to believe in the light again. And that's what love really is. If this story touched something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next one.